In the basement project I've been working on, so far I have built the new wall in the basement that will divide the main family area from the new storage room. In this video, I'd like to build the shelves, and specifically the first shelf, or the shelf at the bottom, which will be a little wider than the other shelves, and it will be the top for a series of drawers that will run along the bottom of the new wall. We decided to make the shelves out of the last pieces of glulam beam from the old pool structure that we removed to build the wood shop. As the rest of the basement is fir and the new wall will be fir, we figured, keeping in that same material palette, to use the fir glulam beams. And it would keep the space somewhat rustic, but hopefully with a bit of a modern edge to it. Now these beams are really too big for me to handle in the shop, so my plan was to cut them in half lengthwise, and I use my circular saw to do this. So I would rip one side, flip the beam over, rip the other side, and that still wasn't quite enough cut to get all the way through. So I would split the beam in half with some wedges. This is where having a bandsaw mill would have been really nice, as I could have just slabbed these beams like they're a log. I got my newfound muscle out to help move my beam parts into the shop. Big thanks to Calvin for helping. I'm excited to be joining the Makers Mob, and I've got a link down below where you can get some free plans from some of the other makers that are on the Makers Mob. With some of the smaller pieces, I was able to joint the cut face on the beam, and this helped with the next phase where I cut the beams into slabs on the bandsaw. These are at about the limit of what I can move around and push through the saw. I had just enough thickness in the beams to get 3 shelves out of each beam, so I had to be very precise about the thickness that I was going to cut. I think the first beam that I cut, I was just a little bit too thick, so the third piece was a little bit on the thin side, but still usable. Then the second beam, I think I went too much in the other direction, and my first 2 were a tiny bit thin, and then the third piece was too thick. By the third beam going through, I got it about right. My goal was to end up with shelves that were 1.5 inches thick. But that meant I needed a little bit of extra coming out of the bandsaw, so I would have some material to plane and joint off to get to a straight shelf. So some of these are the thinner pieces, and then some of them are the thicker pieces. And these are also for the wide shelf at the bottom that I'll be working on next, and the shelves that will be above that on the wall. Once the pieces came off the bandsaw, I could joint one face, then plane the other face, and get a piece that was straight and even all the way along its length. I jointed one edge as well. This would give me one straight side to run against the fence on the table saw. Before I planed the outside faces of the beams, I sanded off the varnish and any remaining dirt that would have been on the beam, just to save my planer knives. And I cut the pieces closer to the length that I was shooting for. Not quite to final length, but very close. Then I could plane the pieces, and I only took off as much as I needed to, trying to keep them as thick as I could. The shelf on the bottom is going to be just a hair under 16 inches wide, and I had cut my beams narrower than that, so I had to glue 2 pieces back together again to get that width. But I figured since it was a glued up beam, adding another seam doesn't really matter. It's just one more seam in the surface of the shelf. I did use biscuits along the joint between the two pieces, not so much for strength, but to help to align the top surface of the shelf. So I wouldn't have to do too much planing or sanding to that top surface to get the joint to match up. And I can clamp that and let it dry. As I worked on this glulam material, I really wanted to cover up the knots in the beam. So I figured for this first bottom shelf, I would make that a little more special and cut out plugs to cover up the knots on that top surface of that shelf. So I found a piece of maple, and I cut and planed that to a thickness that would work. I had some cat heads that Claire had drawn for the dining room table project. So I decided I could use those as they're sort of a round shape and they would cover up the knots nicely. So I cut out two different sizes, one with an 1/8 inch bit and one with a 1/4 inch bit. I also had two silhouettes of full cats, so the head and the body, that I could use for two spots that I needed a bigger patch for. When I was laying these out, I had thought I would just cut them out individually on the bandsaw and flip them over and use them as plugs and then sand off or plane off the bit that's sticking up from the plug. But in thinking about it, it made more sense to cut the plugs out completely so I could put them in either right side up or upside down. So the full-size cats I cut out as I had planned, and the cat heads I began to think I should cut them in strips so that I can cut the back off completely, or cut off the material that's holding the plugs together completely. So these are the 1/4 inch plugs, and these are the 1/8 inch plugs. And the 1/8 inch plugs, I figured out I could separate them in sets of 3 with the radial arm saw. I had just enough room between each column for the kerf of the radial arm saw blade. So I cut all of those out. Once I got the system going, it went pretty quickly. Then I found I should sand the back, as my plan at this point was to run these through the table saw, and I needed a flat back to run against the fence on the table saw. If I ran it through on one side with the blade at about half the height of the piece, I could then flip the piece over, keeping the same side against the fence, and cut the other side and free the plugs from the back. Once I got this figured out and set up, it went really quickly. So cutting the plugs out with the back attached allows you to pack the plugs in tighter because you don't need as much material to support a free-floating piece. So it may seem like I'm using a lot of wood to cut the back off, but it's actually allowing me to fit a lot more plugs onto the piece of wood itself. For the bigger plugs, which I cut out with the 1/4 inch bit, I really didn't think this was going to work on the table saw because of their height. So I thought I'd try it on the bandsaw, and this actually worked even better. This is, I think, how I will do it in the future. It felt a lot safer. I just made a quick fence, and I used my feather board to hold the piece up against the fence. Then I could just push the strip of plugs through the blade, and it would just cut them off. So now I can put my plugs in place. So I had one drawing, but I had two different sizes, and I could flip that image around. So I had two different versions of the same image. And I decided I could make 3 slightly different angles. So I laid them out and labeled what I wanted at each knot. Then I could move the CNC to each knot and re-zero it over the knot and cut out the hole for the plug based on its orientation and its angle. Another way to do it would have been to have measured the location of every knot, made a big master drawing with all the plugs on it, and had the machine cut everything out all at once. But this seemed time-consuming trying to do that kind of accurate drawing, and it seemed riskier because you sort of push go and you hope you did everything right. So I sort of did it the other way, where I did each plug individually and decided which file to use on each plug. And once I had all the holes cut, I could go back and glue everything in place. This is the full cat plug. I had two spots where I had large defects that I wanted to cover, and this worked just like the other plugs. Once everything was glued in place and the glue had set up, I could run the whole thing through the planer and get everything flush. I think on the big cats that stuck up a little bit, I used the belt sander to get them closer to the surface of the shelf. And the smaller plugs were fairly close to the surface, so it went through the planer just fine. And my joiner gives a slightly better surface, as it's a carbide cutter head. So I did a light pass on each side on the joiner, just to get a better surface. And I jointed one edge, and after joining one edge, I could use that against the fence and the table saw to rip the shelf to its final width. Now the shelf is long enough that I made it in two pieces, so I wanted both of those to have exactly the same width. Then I needed to cut the pieces to length, so I set up my movable cart as a side table, and I have some roller bearings on that cart that I can use to hold up the end of long pieces like this. I needed the seam between the two pieces to line up perfectly as well. And I sanded them to get a nice finish, and I can take them inside. So it's in the house and it's all installed, and I figured the installation process was a project in itself. So I will leave that for the next video. But it turned out nice, everything went together, there weren't too many big problems. But it looks really good. And we also had new carpet put in, so the room's actually starting to look and feel finished. Thanks for watching.